So today I want to talk about race with you, and how we'll look into how that can impact student school experience, both in your readings and in another baby lecture later. But we just want to look at some basics today so that we're kind of all working from the same basic framework when we talk about race. So today I want you to be able to use appropriate labels or words when you're referring to certain people groups or circumstances. I want you to understand how a predilection towards a certain group, usually your own, can lead to discrimination or racism. And then we'll look at 4 different types of racism, and in class or in another situation online, you'll be able to identify the types of racism with examples from current events or from created scenarios. So let's talk about labels first, because in the past I've assumed that students in college know the types of labels that they should be using when referring to others, but then every once in a while I'll get someone who uses an offensive label. So I just want to make sure that we all have an understanding of what's appropriate language and what's inappropriate or could be offensive language. So some appropriate terms, things that are okay to use when you're talking about someone who's African American. You can say African American, you can say black. It's not appropriate to say a colored person. And I've heard this probably 5 or 6 times here on campus, and not out of anything malicious, but just out of ignorance. We don't use that term anymore in the United States because it beckons back to a time when we had segregation, because the word was used to describe the fountain that they could use, the colored fountain, the colored entrance, the colored section of a restaurant. So it's really offensive to call someone colored. However, you can call someone a person of color, or if you're talking about people who are brown or black but have a marginalized experience in our society, you might refer to the whole group of both Latino, Hispanic, black as people of color, because you want to use, perhaps you're talking about all the marginalized people in the United States and you just want to include them all, then you would say people of color. So speaking of Latino and Hispanic, Latino, and you may get into this again with a student lesson later, but Latino refers to people from Latin American countries. So Brazil would be included in the description of Latino. So I have family from Brazil, my sister-in-law and my niece and nephews. And so they could be classified as Latino, but they are not classified as Hispanic because they do not speak Spanish. Hispanic refers to people from Spanish-speaking countries. But in Brazil, they speak Portuguese, so they would be Latino, but not Hispanic. However, I know in academia, when I was in graduate school, the term Hispanic was not a favored one. It wasn't preferred because it kind of sounds a little more governmental as far as statistics and things. And so Latino tends to deal more with the culture. You could also say Chicano if that's appropriate for the people group you're talking about. But you can still use Hispanic. It's just specifically Spanish-speaking countries. So don't group Brazil in that if you choose to use that. We don't really use Indian if you're referring to Native Americans, and that can be confusing in this class and in other situations in your schools, because we actually have people from India to whom we may be referring, and so that can be confusing. So typically we refer to Native Americans either by their tribe or as Native Americans, or American Indian, if you want to be specific, and still use Indian. I'm not a fan of Indian when talking about natives because that's a term we gave to them as the dominant group. So anyway, but there are some Native Americans who prefer to use the term American Indian, so it just depends. Um, Also, like my daughter is guilty of this. She assumes everyone who looks like they're Asian are Chinese. So don't say Chinese when you're referring to people from any Asian country. And the same for Mexican. Mexican's not a derogatory term, and it's also not a term referring to all Hispanic or Latino countries. It's people specifically from Mexico. So, um, I mentioned already, Native American, American Indian are okay, but it's always better to be more specific. So if you know the tribe to which you're referring, use that. If you know the nationality, then use the specific nationality when referring to the person. Um, Another one with Asian that comes up once in a while, and I think it's usually older generations, but I've had two different colleagues use the term Oriental referring to a person. That's highly offensive. Oriental is like maybe a style, like an Oriental rug, but people are not rugs, and so we don't use that term when we're talking about people. It's also, I think it's better to, instead of say that someone is poor, they are of low income, because they could be mighty in spirit, very rich in spirit, but just have less income than others. Um, this is kind of off the topic of culture right now, but I just wanted to put it up there while we're talking about labels. Broken families. I've heard this term used in my classes in the past, and that can be incredibly offensive to a family who maybe has a single parent, or it's another family raising them, perhaps grandparents and so forth. You can have a very loving, rich family experience that does not look like the mother, the father, and 2.3 kids. Um, so I've had friends who have divorced, and their children are much better adapted after the divorce because the family situation was so dysfunctional when the parents were in the same house that the stability was stronger when it was a single parent raising the child. So just because there's divorce in the family or something else has happened doesn't mean that they are broken. That's the point I'm trying to make. It's taken me a while to get you there, but along with that, assuming that all of your students have mom and dad at home can be hurtful. So maybe try to change your language to take this home to your guardian or take this home to your caregiver. And especially with the opioid crisis, what it is today, you're going to find that a lot of your students are being raised by grandparents. And so that could be confusing to them if you keep referring to mom and dad. And it can also help make them feel a stronger sense of loss from the fact that the grandparents are raising them. So just try to keep that in mind when you're using language with your students and families. So let's go on and talk a little bit, just a couple basics about talking about racism and things like that. So first of all, prejudice is an attitude. It's based on preconceived judgment. So you don't necessarily know the person, but you just make assumptions on who they are based on faulty information or no information at all. It could be just by the way they look to you. It could also be from a prior experience that you've had that maybe was a negative one, and so you say all people from this people group are violent because someone jumped me one time who happened to be from that people group. So making those overgeneralizations can cause someone to be prejudiced. So prejudice can lead to discrimination. Actually, even before prejudice, you have a predilection. We all have predilections towards certain things, but what can happen, especially with young people starting out, we tend to want to be around those who are most like us. Okay, so we have a predilection toward. I might have a predilection toward white women who are from the United States, who are professionals, who are educators. So just yesterday at my family reunion, my Italian family reunion, there was a cousin-in-law who is a teacher. So my husband and I spent most of our day talking to the teacher because we have a predilection toward other educators, right? But that can also, when that's coupled with prejudice, where you have this view that those different from you, different from your own predilection, are not worthy or are not as good, then that can lead to discrimination. So you can start with a predilection, and if it goes unchecked, then that can lead to prejudice, or you could have that prejudice independently of predilection, but when you couple the two together, then they can lead to discrimination and racism. Okay, so this really, if you think about it, and we'll talk about this in class, underscores the role that you have in stopping predilection where it is in the student's already tendency, the human tendency toward predilection. So I want you to think about, and we can talk in class, if you're taking this class during the regular semester, about how you as a teacher can really trouble the student's notion of predilection. How can you disturb their predilection so that you widen their circle, so that this little person in the background can be included in the circle there, so that discrimination does not become a part of that student's way of being. Gordon Allport wrote a book called The ABCs of Scapegoating, and he created this continuum of social relationships that I think is really telling and frightful, frankly, but it kind of highlights what we can do as teachers, I think. So he created this continuum starting with friendly and moving all the way down to hostile. And so friendly social relationships start with cooperation. That's the friendliest that we can get, is that we can not only respect each other, we can work together. Okay, so that should be our end goal, is working together. But we remember we have this tendency toward predilection. So Allport says that predilection is wanting to be around others like yourself, and a little bit better than that is to tolerate people who aren't like yourself. Tolerate, isn't that a terrible word? I think it's a terrible word. It just, like, I tolerate olives in my salad, but I'm not going to cooperate with them. I'm not going to eat them. I like let them be present, and that's about it. So that's not really, to me, that's not a very friendly human relationship, right? Respect it doesn't mean that you are accepting that person's lifestyle or way of being, but you at least respect it because they are a human being, they are God's child, and so we are called to respect. But wouldn't it be great if we cooperated with others who are different from ourselves? So we want to move the predilection up to cooperation, okay? And so we want to move our students up to be as friendly as possible in their human groups, cooperation, according to Gordon Allport, being the end goal. Now, if we leave that predilection unchecked, like I mentioned in the previous slide, that can lead to prejudice, which can lead to discrimination, which has in our world history even led to scapegoating. So if you think about the Nazis in World War II and how they laid the blame for the demise of Germany on Jews, and look at how that rationale worked out. You know, they were able to eliminate up to 6 million Jews and other smaller subgroups by scapegoating. So we also can tend to do that in the United States. If you watch some political language on calling people illegals instead of undocumented, for example, blaming them for lack of jobs or for the crime rate, things like that. So we have to really be careful that we teach our students to cooperate with people from different experiences than our own, different races, different cultures, and also teach them to be critical thinkers so that they don't overgeneralize, they don't just they need to learn to question what they read, for example, or what they hear on TV, what they hear in the news, and so forth, so that they don't fall down to the hostile social relationships that Gordon Allport outlines. Lastly, I just want to talk to you about some types of racism, and these will be on your final exam. So individual racism, you're probably very aware of, and that's just a person's individual experience with race, and they may, by having certain habits of mind, overgeneralize, oversimplify, and try to categorize and create people groups where they are in the preferred people group, and anyone outside their group is wrong or doing something incorrect. And so that can happen. You can see individual acts of racism in schools, for example, where a student might make fun of another student based on their nationality or religion or something like that, or culture. So that would be at the individual level. But there's also institutional racism that happens in our American schools, and that's where our systems in place, the bureaucracies, the way we do school is set up to favor the dominant group. And right now, the dominant group in United States society is the white middle class. So, for example, the tracking system is institutional racism, and you may see that in an individual school if you see that there's a higher number of people of color in the lower tracks of academics, and the higher tracks are mostly white students or middle class students. And actually in Grove City School District, I've noticed both my kids are in the gifted program, and it appears that all of the kids in the gifted program that I've ever seen are students that are either professors' kids or professionals' kids. So like in my son's group, a judge, our local judge, his son is in the gifted program. The other professors' kids are in it, and so forth. So that is unfairly, then we're not doing a good enough job of giving low-income students the opportunity at an enriched educational program if all of the students that are in that program are from middle-class families. I hope that makes sense, especially if that's not indicative of the ratio of low income to high income of the entire school. So it should be representative of the student body in general demographics. When I taught in Texas, I taught the inclusion classes and the regular track classes. There was an honors track English as well that my colleague taught, and her classes were almost all white, even though we had over 90% student of color demographic in our school, and my classes were almost all African American Latino, except I had, I think, 5 white students out of 130 or so. That shows, again, institutional racism, in that it's not that anyone set out to be racist, but we have not dealt with the structures of the school that are keeping the white students from getting a superior education to the students of color. So something needs to change there. When I taught in Tennessee, we started an international baccalaureate program. I'll talk to you more about that on another day. But one great thing we did with that program was make it open enrollment. So you did not have to get teacher recommendations. You did not have to test into the program. anyone who wanted to try International Baccalaureate, even though it was a very, very rigorous program, anyone could enter it. And so then once students were in it, if they were struggling too much, they could opt out of it at a later date. But we as teachers allowed for open enrollment. And what I loved about it then was I could look out into my classroom, and the amount of students of color that were in my International Baccalaureate classes was reflective of the demographic of our school. So we had about 40% students of color, and that was about what I had in my classroom. And so there you see that we are not falling victims to institutional racism. Instead, we were really an integrated program. And we'll talk more about integration versus desegregation on another day. Cultural racism we'll get into more when we talk about dominance and privilege, but it's basically the idea that again, in the United States, the dominant society or the dominant group is white middle class, and so it's their cultural practices and cultural history that is dominant as well, and so that's what's expected. And so you will find that in the schools, K-12 public schools, that they are run from a white middle class perspective, because that's the cultural dominance in the United States. And then scientific racism, this little illustration from a long time ago is an example of scientific racism. Eugenics is also an example of scientific racism, but it's the idea of where in the past people have tried to use pseudoscience, or they call it science, but it's not rigorous at all, to justify racism. So this is where they did craniometry, where they would try to say that the shape of the skull determined the intellect of the person, and certain races have certain size skull, and thus that is the reflective of their intellect. And so again, it was trying to use science to justify racism and justify policies that would put races of color at an inferior place in society, and that whites then would dominate the society. Eugenics as well, with World War II, and trying to create the perfect human specimen and the perfect human race. Again, that's using science to eradicate certain races. So unfortunately, this is a part of human history. And actually, even today, you'll find research studies that are being published by universities or publications that are still trying to justify that one race is superior to the other. We'll look at that in class with some examples that I give you, and I ask you to determine what type of racism it is.